Thank you very much to my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar who make these videos possible. You are very appreciated. There's this argument that Katie Montgomery likes to make, and I mean Katie Montgomery really likes to make this argument. In fact, it's probably still scrolling, and this footage is from 6 months ago when I originally came up with the idea for this video, so it would probably be even longer now. The argument in question is what I'm going to call the sexed soul argument, and it's worth taking a little while to unpack and debunk. One reason I think it's worth debunking is because it's actually quite a good argument. I think it's a very useful skill to be able to tell whether you agree with a position or not if the arguments for it are some of the better arguments or some of the worse arguments. And this is one of the best arguments that could be made for trans identity, at least in terms of making trans identity sound smart. Why? Because it takes one of the core criticisms against trans ideology and turns it round on the critics, which is always a fun thing to do. In order to explain how it tries to do this, I'm going to explain the basic substance of the argument. The argument goes that trans people change the signifiers of their biological sex such that all the immediately observable signifiers, which are the only ones that are sociologically relevant, now align with the biological sex that corresponds to their gender identity. As such, to insist that a trans person is not as they identify is to deny the current reality of their biology and to insist that the reality of the sex with which they are born has some kind of transcendent value. Your biological sex is something that stays with you regardless of changes to your body, implying that it in some immaterialist dualistic sense is existent independent of your current biology, which is to say, positing the existence of a sexed soul. And with that said, you can probably see how this argument is attempting to turn the core criticism of trans identity back on itself, and how, if somebody is persuaded by that framing, then this argument would seem very convincing to them. Wow, the GCs have been pretending this whole time that they're the materialists who just care about the cold hard reality of biological sex, when actually they're the ones who believe in immaterial transcendent souls because that's how they conceive of biological sex. But you don't have to look that hard to find some issues here. Firstly, many trans-identified individuals don't even seek out medical transition, meaning at best, this is a trans-medicalist argument that can't really defend trans identity as it is currently conceived of. On that note, this also does nothing to defend the various non-binary conceptions of trans identity. So this argument, in trying to make trans identity seem credible, has to abandon many of the key developments in trans ideology that have become mainstream over the last 2 decades. There's also the fact that changing certain signifiers of your biological sex does not, in fact, mean changing your actual biological sex, the same way changing certain signifiers of your race doesn't mean changing your race, or changing certain signifiers of your age doesn't mean changing your age. The trans argument, as always, relies on a heavily epistemological conception of sex rather than an ontological conception, meaning what matters more to them is what can be readily observed and known rather than what is actually the truth of the matter. I don't accept this premise, and it's definitely something worth exploring in detail in a future video at some point, but for now I'll just say that the reproductive function around which your phenotype is organized is something that exists to be known regardless of your attempts to obscure the knowability of that thing through all sorts of surgeries and cosmetic changes. Although, of course, this gets to the final immediate issue, which is that in the vast majority of cases, biological males who get surgery to appear more convincing as biological females do not become so convincing that you could not possibly tell that they are in fact male. So 99 times out of 100, and that's being generous, somebody who says that a so-called trans woman is in fact a biological male is not denying the presently observable reality of their biology, but is instead directly appealing to it as their primary evidence. So there we go, those are some obvious but important issues with that sexed souls argument. Have we understood it? Have we committed it to memory? And are we ready to deploy those arguments against anybody who tries to present this whole sex souls argument for trans identity? Good. Now, Just for a minute, we're going to ignore all of that because I like a challenge. So I'm going to pretend that this sex souls argument doesn't immediately fail on one of its core premises, and I'm going to grant that yes, when somebody identifies as trans, that is always followed by a complete and convincing apparent change in the reality of their biological sex. I'm granting that, and still this argument doesn't work. And since we're talking about Katie Montgomery, you know that I have a Twitter thread to share where I attempted to hash this out before Katie disappeared after just a few tweets. So pour yourself a cup of tea, get comfy, and let me regale you with a classic Twitter adventure. It started off with Katie making the following tweet. Every time a transphobe posts an old picture of a trans person, they are admitting that if they posted a current one, it would undermine the argument they're making. Now, I responded to this with a pretty obvious counter. If the argument they're making is the fact this person used to look obviously like a man shows that however much their current appearance might look more feminine is an entirely artificial facade, then how they currently look would just be irrelevant to the argument. And then Katie responded, how they look today is fake and how they don't look today is real. This is my argument for taking away their rights. Biology is fake, souls are real, I'm GC. Hey look, it's a reference to how GCs believe in souls. Katie deploying the big guns. I responded, I do enjoy your whole the past is irrelevant shtick. Imagine that logic applied consistently. Oh wow, so you're going to ignore the fact that I'm not currently murdering and focus on the fact I murdered in the past? I guess you must believe in souls and reject biology. Like, on some level you must understand that a white person who gets made up to look like a black person is not a black person, and the most obvious evidence we have for the fact they are indeed a white person is how they looked before being made up. Right? Right, so that's my basic argument, but I'll just show you how the rest of the thread played out before we jump into elaborating on that point. Yes, the past is irrelevant, that's my argument. It's not that I'm pointing out that material sex characteristics affect your life, that magic souls don't, and that hashtag sex matters or anything. That was the last thing Katie said, so then I came in with the last word. The issue is that you're using magic souls here to refer to a past reality, so by saying that such a thing does not matter, you are claiming that the past is irrelevant. When you intimate that the only reason anybody could possibly care about the fact that the black person before them was born white and just had surgery and makeup to appear black is if they care about a magical black soul, you are as good as saying the past is irrelevant. I say final word, there was somebody else who responded, but they responded without realizing that when I used the word intimate, I was using it as a verb, meaning to express. They thought I meant being physically intimate, so they responded, if you're intimate with someone, the only ones that have any business giving a flip are you and the person you're intimate with. And that's a very personal thing, not something for legislation or ideals or even arguments on Twitter. So yeah, I don't think that person's an idiot. Obviously the word intimate and the word intimate are spelled exactly the same, which makes them quite funny to write in a script. But I just thought that misunderstanding was kind of funny. But as you can see here, the issue is laid bare. Even if somebody genuinely changes from being one thing to another, that doesn't mean that what they previously were is irrelevant. The past exists. The past is part of material reality. To act as if materialism means only ever understanding reality in terms of how it is right now is to ignore the fact that there's literally something called historical materialism. Is Katie able to cope intellectually with the fact that historical materialism exists? Or is it just like, what do you mean understanding history through a materialist lens? It doesn't exist anymore, therefore it's not part of material reality. How were the pyramids made? We don't know. It doesn't matter. It's not part of material analysis. They're just there now. And what they used to be, or how they got there, to even ask that question means you must believe in some kind of pyramid soul. Obviously, the past matters. I made a transracial analogy in the Twitter thread, and that's because the transracial analogy always shows how nonsense trans identity is, so I'll just reiterate it. If I made myself up to look like a black person, then the fact that a black person might be at least a little bit interested in the fact that I used to look like a white person, like this, doesn't mean that they think there's some kind of racial soul. They think, presumably, that race is defined with reference to material factors, but the material reality of how I used to look also matters, and it doesn't contradict materialism to consider material reality across time and space. Since I love the transracial analogy, I'll just drive the point home by rewording Katie's original tweet. Every time a trans racephobe posts a picture of a trans black person from when they used to be white, they are admitting that if they posted a current one of them in blackface, it would undermine the argument they're making. Would you be convinced by that as an argument for transracial identity? I hope not. So why would you be convinced by that as an argument for transgender identity? But as good as the trans race analogy is, I don't even need it, because some people came along in this thread and gave a different analogy that was supposed to be disproving me, but ended up actually proving my point perfectly. See, somebody responded to my previous tweet where I accused Katie of believing the past is irrelevant by posting this screenshot of a Twitter conversation where 3 different people say, saying male to female instead of just trans women is like referring to fully grown people as baby to adult. Ah, so you used to be a baby? Are you telling me you were born a baby, but then hormones turned you into an adult? Nice try, giant baby. For the record, I actually find that tweet really funny. Nice try, giant baby. But this was posted to me as if it served to refute or make fun of the point I was making. So I responded. I mean, this sort of proves my point. The difference between progressing from a baby to an adult is dramatically different from somebody hypothetically being an adult without having first been a baby. In Katie's logic, both situations are identical if they're both adults now. The point is that when talking about who somebody is, we should look at their past and present. In the case of somebody being a toddler, that proves they had a normal human development, and them being an adult is precisely not an artificial facade. So, whoops, trans activists accidentally provide an analogy that disproves their own point. My point is that we should look at the past and the present. Katie was the one saying we should only really look at the present. My viewpoint allows me to recognize the significance of being born a biological female, growing up as a girl, maturing through female puberty into becoming a woman, and being now an adult human female, a woman. Likewise, my point of view allows me to distinguish between a human being who was conceived in the womb, gestated therein, born, went through normal human development and became an adult, and somebody who, I guess hypothetically, was always an adult from the moment they came into existence, you know, some kind of clone or automaton. Katie's point of view is that we should say, well, if someone looks on the surface level like a biological female now, we should just consider them to be a woman, and anyone who thinks it's at all relevant that this person used to obviously be biologically male must just not believe in material reality and instead believe in the magic transcendent power of sexed souls. That makes no sense on a surface level, and Katie's own fans help to further prove how little sense it makes by appealing to the process of natural human maturation, which according to Katie is something that can't even really be conceived of because it fundamentally relies on recognizing material change and the significance and relevance of each stage of that material development to each other stage of that development. A while ago, I made a short video addressing the question, what if I magically found myself in the body of a biological female? I will link to that video and you can check it out if you're interested. It is, as far as I know, the only video where I'm pulling a silly face in the thumbnail. Usually I'm a bit too self-conscious to commit myself to that. There are 2 ways you could respond to this hypothetical. The first thing you could do is just refuse to respond to it and say that it is a pointless, stupid hypothetical that has no chance of actually happening, and this is a serious discussion, so let's focus only on objections that relate to real things that actually happen. Alternatively, you could say, well, yeah, sure, if that happened, I would be, assuming you're a man, I would be a woman. Or if you're a woman, you'd say, if I transferred into the body of someone of a different sex, I would be a man. And that would be the reality of the situation, and I would reconcile myself to that. I might not ever like it or be particularly enthused about it, but man, woman, they're both defined by biological reality, so to say that I am in the body of a biological female would be to say that I am now a woman. However, if there's one thing you should know about me by now, it's that I'm a massive fan of saying, hey, you know, we've got these responses that could work and you could make, but let's ignore those. Let's say we can't even use those and we have to make a different response so that I can show even if you take the obvious responses off the table, you can still make responses from the gender critical perspective because the gender critical perspective is so strong. I think you could argue that even if I was transferred into the body of a biological female, I would still be a man because I would still be me and I am a man. Now, I'm a man because of my biological sex, because I'm biologically male. And I've always argued that the referent for whether you're a man or woman is your biological sex. However, if you are then a man based on the initial referent of your biological sex, does that necessarily go away, or is it overridden by a subsequent change in your biological sex? I don't see any reason to argue that would have to be the case. I think you could make an argument that your material reality influences and determines who you are as a person, but there is a point at which who you are as a person becomes so concrete and well established that then who you are as a person is able to override subsequent changes to your material reality and in this case your biological sex. Obviously this would not justify trans identity because a trans-identified male can't claim, well, I'm a woman because of the initial referent of my biological sex because their initial biological sex was male. So they can't claim, well, I'm a woman because of my biological sex having been female and that becoming so entrenched in my identity that now I identify as a woman no matter what because, well, they weren't ever a biological female. In reality, of course, people's biological sex doesn't change. We have never observed any example of a human being's biological sex changing. Your sex is your phenotype, and your phenotype is an expression of your genotype. There are some animals that have a genotype that allows their biological sex to change, but human beings do not have such a genotype. So no human being has ever or will ever change biological sex. However, even if, in this hypothetical scenario, which we don't really need to consider, but even if that were the case, you could still make an argument that we can still define people with reference to the initial condition of their biological sex because, and this is the central thesis of the video, when it comes to material reality, the past matters. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Please feel free to do all the algorithm stuff, like, share, comment, subscribe, like, you know what to do at this point. And that's all really appreciated when you do that stuff. It does help me out. Also, of course, you can give on Patreon, and I will say that I'm finally recording my videos a little bit more in advance. For the past few weeks, I've been recording my videos within just a few days of when they're supposed to be uploaded. I'm recording my video now the Friday before, so obviously it's going up on Wednesday. I'm recording it on Friday before. So that means that I do not have this week's, meaning this week's when it's gone up, Patreon video yet. But, and what I like to do is include a little clip, but last week I didn't include a clip from the Patreon video because I said, well, I'm responding to John Oliver anyway, so that can serve as a clip. But yes, last week I responded to John Oliver, his part 1 video on transgender rights that he did for last week tonight, and this is that. Here's the clip.
There is something inherently wrong with forcing us to listen to your fucked up daydreams about all the sex crimes you would have committed as a teenager had you just been able to find a legal loophole.
John, you think the loophole should exist, so how can you complain about that? Yeah, the thing is, like, what does this even mean, right? Because you're saying it's a sex crime for somebody to identify as a woman and enter a women's changing room. It's a sex crime if they don't really mean it. Which at that point, you're taking this very nebulous concept of trans identity that nobody can really explain particularly coherently, and you're saying that it is in fact so concrete that the difference between an authentic trans identity and an inauthentic trans identity is enough to be the determiner of the criminality of an action. And to me, that is absurd. So if that looks interesting to you, then for as little as $1 a month, you can get access to all of my bonus Patreon reaction content, and you can also participate in recommending other videos for me to react to. All of that for as little as $1 a month, of course. If you want to give more, that is very much appreciated. But whoever is contributing anything, it's all very much, tremendously appreciated. I'm very grateful for it. Thank you. And bye. I'll see you all next Wednesday.